The Holy Week that changed my life. My name is Charles Edward Williams. I'm 32 years old and work as a civil engineer in the city of Asheville, in the mountains of North Carolina. Throughout my adult life, I considered myself a man of science, skeptical by nature, someone who only believed in what I could see, touch, and calculate. I grew up in a traditional Catholic family, but faith was never something that truly moved me. That changed completely during Holy Week of 2024. It all began on a Thursday, the eve of Holy Week. I was finalizing structural calculations for a bridge when I received a call from my mother, Mrs. Dorothy, who lives in Charlotte. "Charles, son, you're coming home for Holy Week, aren't you?" Her voice carried that hope mixed with reproach that only mothers know how to make. "Mom, I have so much work." "Charles Edward Williams, it's been 3 years since you came home for Holy Week. Your father isn't well, and I've been having strange dreams." That last phrase caught my attention. My mother had always been a practical person. "What kind of dreams, Mom?" There was a long pause. "I dream about you, son. I dream that you're in danger, surrounded by terrible darkness. And there's always a voice that tells me, he needs to come home, he needs to be here." A chill ran down my spine. "Mom, it's not just anything, Charles. Come home, please." The desperate tone in her voice made me give in. "All right, Mom, I'll come." When I arrived at my parents' house on Saturday afternoon, I found my mother waiting for me at the gate. She hugged me with a strength disproportionate to her small frame. During dinner, there was something in the air, a subtle tension that I couldn't identify. Around 10 at night, my mother brought a cup of chamomile tea and sat beside me. "Charles, I need to tell you something. Since your father got sick, strange things have started happening in this house." "What kind of things?" "Noises at night, footsteps in the hallway, doors creaking by themselves, and voices." She took out a small notebook. I started writing everything down. She began reading dozens of occurrences from the past months. February 15th, I woke up to someone calling my name. It was a woman's voice, but I didn't recognize it. "Why didn't you tell me this before?" "Because you would have thought your mother was going crazy. But it's not just me, Charles. Mrs. Henderson, the neighbor, has also noticed strange things. And Father Michael came here last week and said he felt a disturbing presence in the house. I went to my old room around midnight, but sleep was slow to come. I was almost asleep when I heard slow footsteps in the hallway, coming toward my room. The footsteps stopped exactly in front of my door. The doorknob began to turn slowly. The door opened a few centimeters, creaking softly. "Dad, Mum," I murmured. The door stopped and began to close again. I got up, turned on the light, and looked down the hallway. It was empty. I went to my parents' room. Both were sleeping soundly. The next morning, my mother confirmed that she had heard the same footsteps at the same time. At Palm Sunday Mass, Father Michael approached us after the ceremony. "Charles, good to see you here. It's good for the family to be united during these days, especially when there's a need for special protection." "Protection against what, Father?" "There are forces that move during Holy Week, Charles. Your family is being tested." During Sunday afternoon around 8 o'clock, we heard a strange sound coming from the living room. We found my father standing in the middle of the room, staring fixedly at the crucifix on the wall. "Did you hear that?" he asked in a hoarse voice. "Hear what?" "The chains dragging." That's when I heard it too. Metal being dragged across the floor, coming from the direction of the bedrooms. The sound stopped when we turned around. My father suddenly seemed confused, not remembering what he had said. On Sunday night, I felt a presence in my room. It wasn't a sound, but like when someone enters the environment. I heard a very low whisper. I turned on the light. The room was empty, but there was a strange smell, sweet, with a touch of decomposition. On Monday, my mother reported that my father had spent the night awake, hearing someone walking on the roof. They were human footsteps, slow, heavy, and sometimes it would stop, as if whoever was there was listening to us talk. During the morning, my father said, "I saw places I didn't recognize, people I didn't know. There was a voice telling me I needed to help them, but that it would be necessary to make a sacrifice." I decided to go out to the bakery. The walk was strange. The neighbors looked at me differently, as if they saw something in me. Mr. Thompson served me coldly. "They say strange things have been happening at your house. Lights turning on in the early morning. Noises." I talked to Mrs. Henderson, our neighbor. "I've seen lights moving inside the house during the early morning hours. And yesterday morning, I saw a shadow in your room window." a shadow of a very tall person. Back home, I found my mother worried. "Your father has been saying strange things, names of people we don't know, and sometimes he speaks in a different language. It sounds like Latin." On Monday afternoon, Father Michael arrived to visit us. His usual serenity had given way to palpable tension. "How are you?" His voice carried real concern. My mother reported all the events. Father Michael listened in silence. "Charles, you're a man of science. What do you think of all this?" "I'm trying to find rational explanations, but it's getting hard to ignore." He walked to the crucifix. "There are spiritual forces that manifest with greater intensity during Holy Week. It's a period of intense spiritual warfare. But why our family? Sometimes God chooses ordinary people to witness His glory, and the enemy tries to prevent this manifestation." That's when we heard a scream coming from my parents' room. We found my father pointing to the dark corner of the room. He's there, a very tall man, dressed in black. His eyes were like black holes, and he was smiling. Father Michael positioned himself between my father and the corner, praying in Latin. Gradually, my father calmed down. "Joseph, you've been chosen for something special. The gift of spiritual sight, the ability to see souls that are suffering in purgatory and intercede for them." Father Michael left us blessed candles and holy water. Before leaving, he called me aside. "Your role is fundamental, Charles. In the next 48 hours, you'll see things that will test all your convictions." Monday night brought a drastic change. The temperature in the living room began to drop rapidly, our breath forming vapor in the cold air. My father became very pale, his hands trembling. "They're coming, those who suffer. They know I can see them now." I began to feel it too, a change in the density of the air, as if dozens of invisible eyes were watching us. There was a physical pressure, as if something was pressing against my skin. "There's a woman there near the window. She's crying. She lost a very young child," my father said, looking at specific points in the room. "And there's an elderly man in despair. His arms are extended, begging for forgiveness." The whispering voices intensified, dozens of people speaking at the same time in different languages. Some I recognized as Old English, others completely strange. The sound was like a desperate choir of lamentations. The lights began to flicker in patterns. 3 quick flashes, pause, 2 slow ones, long pause. The pattern repeated insistently, each time faster. "They're trying to show me they need help," my father explained, sweat running down his face despite the cold. All the lights went out at once, as if someone had cut the electricity to the entire house. The darkness was absolute, denser than any natural night, a darkness that seemed to have its own substance. In the darkness, I gradually began to see. First, they were just shadows at the edges of my vision, forms that disappeared when I tried to focus on them. Then, slowly, they became clearer. People of different ages and eras, all with expressions of deep suffering carved into their spectral faces. The woman near the window was now clearly visible, young, maybe 30 years old, wearing a simple 1940s dress. Her tears seemed like crystals falling into the void, and she held something invisible against her chest with a maternal desperation that broke my heart. "Please," her voice reached me, clear as crystal, loaded with pain that transcended death. "Pray for my son, Gabriel. He was only 5 years old when the fever took him. I couldn't save him. I couldn't." Her voice was lost in sobs that echoed through the walls of the house. Without thinking, the words came out of my mouth automatically. "Hail Mary, full of grace." While I prayed, something extraordinary happened. A soft light, golden and warm, began to emanate from the woman's figure. Gradually, her expression of despair transformed into relief, then into pure gratitude. She smiled, a smile of indescribable peace, and began to fade, enveloped by that divine light. "Thank you," she whispered, her voice now filled with joy. "Finally, I can find him again." "That's it, Charles. That's what we were called for," said my father, tears of emotion streaming down his face. But not all the presences in the house were as gentle as the grieving mother. While we continued helping other souls, a wounded soldier from the Civil War, a child who drowned in the river, a priest who carried the weight of unconfessed sins, I felt a sinister change in the air. It was as if a supernatural storm was forming around us. The temperature plummeted even further. Now I could see my breath creating dense clouds of vapor, and there was a smell in the air that made me gag, sulfur mixed with rotting flesh, as if someone had opened the doors of hell itself. At the end of the hallway where moments before stood the repentant priest, there was now a completely different figure. It was impossibly tall, taller than any normal human being, its form extending from floor to almost touching the ceiling. It was wrapped in shadows that moved independently, like liquid and living smoke. Where its face should be, there was only a black void, except for 2 points of red light that pulsed like malevolent embers. It was like looking directly at the essence of evil. "Don't look directly at it," my father whispered urgently, his voice trembling with real fear. "And don't stop praying, never stop praying." The creature began moving toward us, but it didn't walk. It glided, its feet never touching the ground. It left a trail of darkness behind it, as if it sucked the very light from the environment. The sound it made was terrible, like metal being dragged over stone mixed with whispers of hatred in dead languages. My mother, although she couldn't see the entity, felt its malevolent presence. Her body trembled violently, and she began to pray with desperate intensity. "Our Father who art in heaven, hallowed be thy name." The creature stopped abruptly, as if the sacred words had created a physical barrier it couldn't cross. For a few seconds, it remained motionless, then began to slowly circle the room, keeping its distance, like a predator studying its prey and looking for weak points. When it spoke, its voice was like glass being ground, harsh and penetrating, echoing from multiple directions at once. "You don't know what you're doing, insignificant little ones. These souls belong to me by right. They sinned. They deserve to suffer eternally." Objects began to move violently around the room. Books flew from shelves like projectiles. Pictures fell from walls with crashes. The coffee table slid several feet. The crucifix on the wall trembled dangerously. "I can offer much more than your pathetic faith," the voice continued, now with a seductive and poisonous tone. "Power over other men, wealth beyond imagination, knowledge of the universe's secrets. Everything you desire will be yours." Other shadowy figures began to materialize at the edges of the room. They weren't purgatory souls. They were creatures like the first, entities of pure malevolence that seemed to feed on fear and despair. Their red eyes created points of sinister light in the darkness. The prayers intensified. My mother had moved to the rosary, its beads creaking between her trembling fingers, and we accompanied her. With each Hail Mary, each Our Father, the creatures seemed to recoil slightly, their forms becoming less solid, but they didn't give up. They changed tactics, using the most terrible weapon in their arsenal. Suddenly, the main creature's voice transformed. Now it sounded exactly like my grandfather Anthony's voice, who had died when I was a child. That warm and loving voice that told me stories before bed. "Charles, my dear grandson," it said with perfect imitation, "why are you doing this to us? Come here with Grandpa. Leave that fanatic father alone. You were always my favorite grandson." For a terrible moment, my heart hesitated. The voice was so real, so convincing, that for an instant, I believed it really was him. Childhood memories flooded my mind. The smell of his pipe, his rough hands teaching me to make paper airplanes. But then I remembered Father Michael's words about the enemy's weapons, and clarity returned. "You're not my grandfather," I said aloud, looking directly at the creature, challenging its lie. "My grandfather is at peace with God. You're just a pathetic imitation." The reaction was explosive. The false voice of Grandpa Anthony distorted into something monstrous, a roar of primordial rage that made the house windows tremble in their frames. Several of them shattered, spreading glass shards across the floor. Then, "Try this," the original voice returned, now loaded with malice that made my soul shrink with terror. What happened next was beyond any nightmare I could imagine. The visions hit me like a tsunami of horror. It was no longer simply being in our living room. It was as if we were transported to the darkest places of existence. I found myself in an infinite cemetery under a blood-red sky, surrounded by open graves from which decomposed hands emerged, trying to drag me down. The smell of death and decomposition was suffocating. I could hear the agonizing screams of my father and mother, but I couldn't see them in the nightmare landscape. Distorted versions of everyone I loved appeared before me. My girlfriend Sarah with her face melted, accusing me of abandoning her. Work colleagues with empty eyes, blaming me for imaginary failures, all rejecting me with visceral hatred. "You're a failure," they screamed in unison. "You're worthless. Not even God can love you." The despair I felt was absolute. deeper than any depression, more terrible than any loneliness. It was as if all hope had been sucked from the universe, leaving only emptiness and self-destruction. At the height of this mental hell, when I was about to surrender completely to despair, I felt something warm in my hand, the St. Michael the Archangel medal that Father Michael had given me. The metal was so hot it almost burned my skin, but the moment I touched it, a spark of clarity cut through the terror. "St. Michael the Archangel," I began to recite with a trembling voice, "defend us in battle, be our refuge against the wickedness and snares of the devil." The horrible visions began to fragment and disappear. Gradually, I could hear my parents' voices joining mine, all reciting the same powerful prayer that brought us back to reality. But the demonic entities didn't give up easily. They changed tactics once more, this time attacking what they thought was the weakest link. Through the darkness, I saw shadowy creatures attaching themselves to my father like giant spiritual parasites. They were like leeches made of pure malevolence, trying to drain his life force and corrupt the gift God had given him. My father screamed in agony, not physical but spiritual, the pain of having his soul directly attacked. "Don't touch me," he screamed at us, his voice distorted and multiple, as if several entities were speaking through him. "They're trying to use my body as a portal to reach you." With horror, I realized the diabolical strategy. They weren't just trying to scare us, they were trying to possess my father, use the very gift God had given him as an entry door to our family and our house. "Mom," I screamed urgently, "we need to protect him now." Even blinded by terror, my mother understood instinctively. We took the blessed candles that Father Michael had given us and lit them around the armchair where my father sat, their flames creating a perfect circle of sacred light. The moment we completed the circle, a luminous barrier formed around him, a wall of golden light that pulsed with divine power. The parasitic creatures trying to attach to his soul were violently repelled, their screams of pain and rage making the entire house tremble. But our victory was only temporary. The entities retreated to reorganize, and when they returned, it was with a force that made me understand that everything we had faced until then had been just a prelude. "You have no idea what you face," the main voice echoed throughout the house, coming from all directions at once. "We are legion, we are eternal, we are infinite hunger, and you are just weak and insignificant mortals." The entire house began to shake. Cracks appeared in the walls, pieces of plaster fell from the ceiling. It was as if the very foundations of reality were being shaken by the malevolent presence. "On Good Friday," the voice continued, now loaded with a terrible promise, "when the veil between worlds is at its thinnest, we will return with all our strength, and this time there will be no escape. This time your souls will belong to us forever." With those threatening words echoing through the walls, the entities disappeared, leaving us trembling in the darkness, knowing that the worst was yet to come. The next 2 days were a tense preparation for the final confrontation. Tuesday and Wednesday brought spiritual visitors every night, more complex souls, difficult cases that had resisted peace for decades. We developed a sacred routine: identify each soul, understand their suffering, pray specifically for their liberation. Father Michael visited us daily, bringing more sacred objects and preparing us spiritually. His expression became more serious each day. "You've become a spiritual beacon," he explained on Wednesday, studying our tired faces. "Souls from the entire region know they'll find help here. But this also means the forces of darkness will concentrate all their power here. You've become the main battlefield." "And on Good Friday?" I asked, already dreading the answer. Good Friday is the day of Christ's Passion, when redemptive suffering reaches its apex. But it's also when evil makes its last and most desperate attack before the resurrection. The veil between worlds becomes thinner, allowing manifestations of both celestial and infernal power that would normally be impossible. On the morning of Holy Thursday, I woke with a sense of apprehension that seemed to come from within my bones. The air in the house was electrically charged, like before a violent storm. Every movement seemed to generate invisible sparks. Every word echoed strangely. My father was visibly paler and more fragile, but his eyes shone with an iron determination I had never seen before. "Today they come in greater numbers," he said during breakfast, his hands trembling slightly as he held his cup. "I can feel them approaching from all directions. It's as if they've been waiting for this moment for a long time." During the day we tried to maintain some normalcy, but it was impossible to ignore the signs that multiplied exponentially. Objects moved subtly when we weren't looking directly. photographs on walls tilted by themselves. Sudden temperature changes created currents of cold air that whispered our names. Around 5 in the afternoon, Father Michael arrived for what he called the final vigil. His expression was more serious than I had ever seen. "This will be a night different from anything you've ever faced," he said, placing a heavy suitcase on the living room table. "You're no longer simply helping individual souls. You've become fundamental pieces in a spiritual war that transcends this house, this city, perhaps even this time." He opened the suitcase, revealing sacred objects that seemed to pulse with their own power. Saints' relics, holy water from Lourdes, sacred oil blessed by the Pope, St. Michael the Archangel medals made with metal that had touched Christ's tomb. "Use this," he said, handing us the medals. "And remember, tonight, if the forces of darkness can manifest with maximum intensity, the same happens with the forces of light. You won't be alone." As night approached, paranormal activity intensified dramatically. Around 8 o'clock, the first souls began to arrive, and we immediately realized these were different from all the previous ones. They were extreme cases, souls that had resisted salvation for centuries. A medieval inquisitor, carrying the weight of unjust tortures, his garment still stained with spectral blood. A woman from the colonial era who had sold slave children, her arms extended in desperate supplication. Soldiers from forgotten wars, still screaming battle commands trapped in eternal loops of violence. And the children, so many children, some victims of diseases, others of violence, all lost and confused, not understanding why they couldn't find their parents. "Why are there so many children this time?" I asked my father, feeling my heart break. "Because they're the easiest to manipulate," he replied, his voice loaded with deep sadness. "The forces of evil use them as emotional shields, knowing our instinct is to protect them. But they're also the purest, the ones who most deserve our help." We spent hours praying for each soul, spiritual work that was physically exhausting. Each successful prayer filled us with joy, seeing divine light envelop the liberated soul, but also drained us, as if we were donating part of our own life force to the process. As midnight approached, I could feel something monstrous moving in the shadows around the house. These were no longer the relatively subtle presences of previous days. It was as if entire armies of malevolent entities were positioning themselves for a coordinated attack. The air became so thick it was hard to breathe. There was a constant sound, low and threatening, like distant drums or the beating of giant wings. The smell of sulfur became suffocating. "They're organizing," my father said, sweat running down his face despite the supernatural cold. "It's as if the entire infernal hierarchy is mobilizing for this battle." Midnight arrived like an explosion. It wasn't a gradual transition. One moment we were in growing tension. The next we were at the epicenter of total spiritual warfare. All the lights in the house went out simultaneously, but this time the darkness was different. It was active darkness that moved and breathed, that had weight and malevolence of its own. It was like being inside a giant creature made of pure darkness. And then they came. They were no longer some isolated entities like before. It was a true legion, hundreds, maybe thousands of demonic creatures, each more terrible than the last. Some had vaguely humanoid forms, but distorted in grotesque ways. Others were completely abstract, impossible geometries of pure hatred, tentacles of despair, spirals of malevolence that hurt the eyes just to look at. "The time has come," a voice echoed through all reality, not just through the house. It was as if the universe itself was screaming, "You have interfered too much, you have challenged the natural order. Now you pay the final price." The attack was immediate and absolutely brutal. It was no longer subtlety or psychological attempts to scare us. It was a direct and total assault against our minds, bodies, and souls simultaneously. I was hit by a wave of terror that transcended any normal human emotion. It was as if all the fear that had ever existed in the universe was concentrated and fired directly into my brain. My body convulsed, my muscles contracted violently, and I felt as if my sanity was being torn apart by invisible claws. Through my own scream of agony, I could hear my mother crying desperately and my father vomiting while screaming prayers amid sobs of indescribable suffering. Apocalyptic visions invaded my mind. I saw myself being tortured by demons for all eternity, watching my family be dismembered before my eyes, witnessing the complete destruction of everything I had ever loved. And worse, I felt that somehow I was guilty of everything, that I had brought this destruction upon everyone by interfering with forces I didn't understand. "You caused this," the voices whispered in my head. "Your arrogance condemned your family. Your mother will die tonight because of you. Your father will be possessed and do horrible things. And you will live forever knowing you were guilty." The despair I felt was absolute, deeper than depression, emptier than loneliness. It was as if all hope had been not only removed from the universe, but proven to have never existed in the first place. At the height of this spiritual torture, when I was completely convinced that we had failed and that the forces of evil had definitively won, my hand found the St. Michael the Archangel medal on my chest. The metal was so hot it almost burned me, but the moment I touched it, a single word echoed in my mind with crystalline clarity: resist. It wasn't my own voice, nor my parents' or Father Michael's. It was something much greater, more powerful, more loving than anything I had ever experienced. With that single word as an anchor, I managed to form the first words of the prayer: "Saint Michael the Archangel, defend us in battle." I immediately felt a change. The horrible visions began to fragment, the accusing voices diminished in volume, and I could hear, first faintly, then stronger and stronger, my parents' voices joining mine. But the demonic entities didn't give up. Realizing their psychological attack was failing, they changed to even more desperate and dangerous tactics. I saw shadowy creatures, no longer trying to attach to my father like parasites, but literally trying to tear him spiritually, separate his soul from his body, to inhabit it permanently. He screamed in agony that transcended any physical pain, his body convulsing as he fought to maintain control over himself. "They are trying to break me," he managed to say between convulsions. "They want to use my gift to attack you directly." I understood with total horror. They weren't just trying to possess him. They were trying to corrupt the very divine gift he had received, transform it into a weapon against us and against all the souls we were trying to save. My mother and I moved instinctively, creating a larger circle of blessed candles, pouring holy water in specific patterns that Father Michael had taught us. Each drop of holy water that touched the ground created small explosions of sacred light that made the creatures recoil, screaming in pain. The battle intensified beyond anything imaginable. The house itself began to tear apart around us, windows exploding simultaneously, walls cracking with sounds like bones breaking, furniture being hurled against the ceiling by invisible forces. It was as if physical reality itself was being lacerated by the intensity of the spiritual conflict. "You have no idea what you face." The main voice now echoed not just in the house, but seemed to come from the very subsoil, as if all the earth beneath our feet was screaming. "We are legend. We are eternal hunger. We are the primordial void that existed before light." For a terrible moment, I believed they were right. We were just three mortal humans facing forces that had existed since before creation. How could we hope to win? It was exactly at this moment of total despair that the change occurred that would transform everything. A light began to emanate from the crucifix on the living room wall, but it wasn't ordinary physical light. It was something that completely transcended the normal visible spectrum. It was pure holiness manifested in a way our souls could perceive directly, light that carried within itself all the love, all the compassion, all the justice that had ever existed. The reaction of the demonic creatures was instantaneous and violent. They recoiled as if they had been physically struck, their screams of pain echoing at frequencies that made our bones vibrate. And in that sacred light, figures began to materialize. The first I could distinguish clearly was of a majesty that made my soul prostrate automatically. It was St. Michael the Archangel, but not as in Renaissance paintings. He was a warrior of pure light, with stature that filled the room from floor to ceiling, wearing armor that seemed forged with condensed stars. In his hands, a sword that was not metal but liquid light, love crystallized in blade form. His eyes were like supernovas containing all of God's righteous fury, but also infinite compassion for all creatures that suffer. When he spoke, his voice was like music of the spheres, perfect harmony that made the soul instantly recognize its divine origin. "Enough," he said simply, and the demonic creatures that moments before seemed invincible shrank like wounded dogs. But he wasn't alone. Other luminous figures materialized quickly. I could recognize some saints by the symbols they carried, Saint Joseph with his carpenter's tools transformed into weapons of light, Saint Teresa with roses that were small suns, Saint Francis surrounded by spectral animals that glowed with primordial innocence. And then, at the center of all these sacred presences, a figure materialized that made my heart almost stop from pure emotion and adoration. It was Christ, not as in the artistic representations I knew, but as a presence of love so intense and power so absolute that it was almost impossible to look directly at him. His wounds from the crucifixion were not injuries. They were portals of light containing all the pain and all the redemption of humanity, all suffering transformed into salvation. When he approached my father and placed a hand on his forehead, the effect was instantaneous and miraculous. All the shadowy creatures trying to invade him were not just expelled, but literally disintegrated by the divine touch, their screams of agony transforming into nothing. Joseph. His voice was like all music that had ever been composed, like every word of love that had ever been spoken. You were faithful when tested. You chose love over fear, faith over doubt. Your sacrifice was not in vain. Lord, my father replied, tears of pure gratitude streaming down his face. I am not worthy of all this. None of you are worthy, Christ replied, and his smile contained all the tenderness of the universe. But all are loved unconditionally, and love is not based on merit, but on grace. He turned to our complete family, his eyes meeting ours with an intensity that seemed to read our entire soul in an instant. Charles, Dorothy, you too were called to this battle before you were even born, and you responded with courage that honors all humanity. The presence of these celestial forces completely transformed not just the atmosphere of the house, but the very structure of reality around us. The demonic creatures, which moments before seemed so powerful and threatening, now cowered in the deepest shadows, clearly outmatched and defeated. But they made one final and desperate attempt, throwing all their remaining malevolence into one last attack. "This isn't fair," they screamed in unison, their voices uniting in a choir of pure hatred. "These souls belong to us by right. They sinned. They chose evil. They deserve to suffer eternally." It was Saint Michael the Archangel who responded, stepping forward and pointing his sword of light directly at the agonizing creatures. His voice echoed with the authority of one who speaks in the name of God himself. "Divine justice is not yours," he declared, and each word carried the weight of eternity. "You know only condemnation, but God knows mercy. Where there is sincere repentance, there is forgiveness. Where there is true love, there is redemption. And where there is intercession made with a pure heart," he looked at our family, "there is always hope." It was then that I witnessed something that will remain engraved in my soul until the last day of my existence. Christ addressed the purgatory souls that were still present in our house, all those we had been trying to help throughout this sacred week, but who hadn't been able to find complete peace. "Come," he said with a simplicity that contained all the complexity of divine love. And they came, all of them. The burned man who carried guilt for a fire he couldn't prevent. The elderly woman crushed by the weight of ancient betrayals. The lost children who had been looking for their parents for decades. The wounded soldier still screaming orders from a forgotten war. The priest who had doubted his faith on his deathbed. Dozens, hundreds of souls that had been trapped in limbo between worlds. One by one, Christ touched them, and one by one they were transformed. The pain completely disappeared from their faces, replaced by a peace so deep it radiated like light itself. Guilt dissolved, fear transformed into joy. Despair was consumed by radiant hope. Their spectral forms became luminous, bright as stars, and began to ascend, not physically but spiritually, finally free for the eternal rest they had sought for so long. The burned man, before disappearing completely enveloped in golden light, turned to us and said with a voice transformed by pure gratitude, "Thank you. Thank you for not giving up on us when even we had given up on ourselves." The elderly woman waved with her now luminous hands, her tears being of joy so intense it seemed to illuminate the environment. The children finally laughed, a sound of celestial happiness that made my heart expand in a way I didn't know was possible. In a matter of minutes, all the purgatory souls had been liberated. The house, which for days had been filled with suffering presences, now vibrated only with echoes of gratitude and peace. And with their departure, the demonic forces lost any justification or power to remain. "You have failed completely," Saint Michael the Archangel declared to the remaining shadowy creatures. His sword of light now pointed directly at them like a final sentence. The souls you wanted to keep in captivity found freedom through this family's sacrificial love. You have no more claim here. Now depart to the depths from whence you came and never return to this place. The demonic entities tried to resist for a few final moments, but it was completely useless. In the presence of Christ and the celestial hosts, they had absolutely no power. One by one they were banished, not destroyed, for that would give them an importance they didn't deserve, but simply removed. Their screams of defeat echoed briefly before fading into the nothingness from which they had come. The silence that followed was not absence of sound, but absolute presence of peace. The silence that followed was both comforting and deafening. We sat there trying to process everything, flooded with a peace never before experienced. "It's over," my father said. They found peace, all of them. Everything in the room was in its place, as if the battle had never happened, but we knew it had happened. "I feel complete," my father replied when my mother asked how he felt. "For the first time, I've truly fulfilled the purpose for which I was created. And the gift? I can still see beyond the physical world, but now it's different. There's no more fear. It's as if I've received a map to navigate this territory." I could feel something new within me, not the same gift as my father's, but an expanded consciousness, sharper perception of the spiritual dimension. "We continue living, but differently," my father said. "We know there's much more to reality. And with this knowledge comes responsibility." When Father Michael arrived on Good Friday morning, his expression showed he knew what had happened. "You were chosen for something very special, and you rose to the occasion. Joseph, your gift is real and permanent. There will be other occasions when souls will need your help. And you, Charles, discovered that your scientific mind is compatible with spiritual reality." We spent the day in prayer and reflection, but with gratitude and peace. In the afternoon, neighbors began to appear, feeling a different peace coming from our house. My father talked with each one, offering words that deeply touched each visitor. "It's part of the gift," my mother explained. "He sees the spiritual needs of living people too." On Easter Sunday, the celebration of the resurrection had completely new meaning. We were a transformed family. Father Michael revealed to us, "What happened to you wasn't isolated. There were similar manifestations in several families in the region. You were the epicenter of a spiritual renewal." In the following weeks, I returned to work in Asheville with a completely different perspective. I saw my projects as ways to serve, create spaces where people could live better connected. My father developed a regular practice of helping people who sought spiritual guidance. My mother became a natural counselor for women in the community, and I became a bridge between the scientific world and this new spiritual reality. 6 months later, I received a call. "Charles, Father Michael gave me your number. It's about my father. He sees people who have already died." I recognized all the signs. I believe in these things and I can help. I knew it would be the first of many similar calls. The gift wasn't just for us, it was to be shared. That Holy Week had transformed me from a convinced skeptic into someone who understands that the universe is much vaster than any equation. It had given me a purpose beyond building bridges over rivers. Now, I help build bridges between worlds. Every time I remember the souls that found peace, the divine presence that filled our house, I know it was worth every moment of terror. I discovered that true faith is the courage to follow, even without completely understanding the path. Today, as I write, I can hear my father talking softly with a lost soul that sought our house. His voice is calm, full of compassion. Another soul will find peace through the gift granted to our family. The world is full of mysteries that science doesn't explain, but that doesn't mean they aren't real. It just means there are dimensions of reality that transcend our current understanding. If we have the courage to open our hearts and minds, we can become part of these mysterious dimensions, instruments of something much greater than ourselves. This is my story. This is my faith. This is my new life. And I wouldn't trade it for anything in this world or any other. Subscribe to Darkness Activity for spine-chilling supernatural stories. Hit that subscribe button, explore our haunting video collection, and drop a comment sharing your own paranormal experiences. Like if these stories gave you goosebumps. Your comments fuel our community. Tell us what terrified you most.